Sins are bad. That's what we've been taught all of our lives. And I think it's important that people learn what the sins are. There are bad sins, there are very bad sins, there's little white lies, and then there's crimes. Sins are on a scale. It's a scale. Now, the really, really bad ones are what we call capital sins, or the 7 deadly sins, as a lot of pop culture references might refer to, or church teachings. And did I say church teachings? This right here is the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It is the entire book of teachings. If you have a question about what the Catholic Church might teach, you will find it in here. There is oftentimes a paragraph about it. And there is a paragraph about the 7 deadly sins. So we have our definition right here. We do not need to go to Google. Paragraph 1866 says, vices can be classified according to the virtues they oppose, or also be linked to the capital sins which Christian experience has distinguished. Following St. John, Cassian, and St. Gregory the Great, they are called capital because they engender other sins, other vices. They are pride, avarice, envy, wrath, lust, gluttony, and sloth, or acedia. It's the same word. They interchange a lot of words when it comes to the sins. That is the Catechism definition, and that's all I know about the Catholic Church. I'm definitely not a practicing Catholic. Now, to continue our lesson on the 7 deadly sins, it's important, I think, to put out examples. People learn best when they have visual examples, and they learn best when they're comparing things that they're familiar with. I think to best teach you about the 7 deadly sins, I need to use something that is, 1, popular, something you'll recognize, and 2, something that is so full of examples of sins and terrible things that I'll have plenty of content to talk about. And 3, I need to have something that I'm willing to talk about for the next hour. And that leaves only one option. That's right. We're going to be studying Game of Thrones. Game of Thrones is definitely probably one of the more popular TV shows that have ever been created. And it got me thinking when I started thinking about the 7 deadly sins. I thought that comparing the Game of Thrones characters with the 7 deadly sins would be a cool way to analyze the art piece in a sense. And I think before we start, we're going to go ahead and list the 7 deadly sins, and I'm going to be pairing each 7 deadly sin to a character in the show. So we have gluttony, sloth, wrath, pride, envy, lust, and greed. The 7. So I'm going to be pairing each 7 deadly sin with a character in the show. Now, that's not to say that that character only shows that sin or they're entirely bad. That's something that Game of Thrones actually does a great job of, is all of the characters, the main characters in a sense, all have a mix of very admirable qualities and not so desirable traits. And I thought this was a really, really fun project to do. It really forced me to look in the characters in a different way. So yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. I think we should start easy. The first one we're going to start with is gluttony. Now, gluttony is the overindulgence or over excess of food, drink, substance to the point where it's not good for your body. I'm starting with this one because it is the easiest. We're going to go with our pride and joy, the start of the season, King Robert Baratheon. Robert Baratheon is the first king of the 7 kingdoms that we see in the series. He was close friends with Ned Stark, and as we're introduced to Robert, we kind of dive into who Robert really is in the character, and it's clear that he's kind of unhappy, but it's been pretty clear that Robert overindulges. He was always drunk, constantly drinking wine. He was overweight. It was actually quite a bit of banter between Ned and Robert that they would make fun of each other in their old age getting fat. It was pretty clear that Robert was subject to gluttony, and the biggest example of this was he actually died in a hunting accident because he was drunk. Now, it is later set up that the Lannisters actually were over offering wine and making sure that he was drunk, and it was clear that he did have drinking problems, so that is why Robert is definitely the best character for gluttony. Second, we're going to go to lust. Now, lust is the intense sexual desire over people or the use of people as objects for sexual pleasure. I would say this is probably one of the most well known. This one was a little bit harder, but ultimately I did choose Craster. Craster is a character that was introduced in season 2. He is one of the free men who lives beyond the walls. He oftentimes gives shelter and serves as a kind of readout for the Night Watch. But we learn from Craster when Jon Snow in season 2 goes beyond the wall with a group. They stay at Craster's keep for a couple days. And that is when we kind of learn more about Craster's lifestyle. He sleeps with his daughters. They describe his lifestyle as he marries his daughters and they give him more daughters. And to which Jon Snow then asks the question, well, what if he has sons? And unfortunately, Craster kills his sons because he doesn't want them to steal his daughters away from him or challenge his authority over the family. So it's clear that he sees his daughters only as a means to an end and clearly just takes pleasure in them, and that's quite unnatural. And I think that that was a great definition of lust. We'll go to greed. Greed is a hard one. A lot of these 7 deadly sins will cross over into each other, and it's hard because a lot of times greed and envy can be mixed. So once I do greed, I will jump into envy. But for greed, I chose Lord Petyr Baelish. I think it's safe to say that Petyr Baelish is probably the most complex character in Game of Thrones. I never guessed the next move that he had coming. I definitely think he's the subject of greed because Lord Petyr Baelish, also known as Littlefinger, is master of coin at the start of the series. And he's kind of seen as this elusive, mysterious member of the court. But it is also known that he runs brothels. He uses his brothels and the prostitutes that he hires as sort of spies for him. And he learns information about the brothel's customers, which are often high members of court, wealthy lords. He learns their secrets, but he also uses the brothels to gain favor with the high lords of the court. And it's pretty much assumed that that is how he rose in power, because we learn Petyr Baelish's backstory is he came from an incredibly minor house with no holdings, basically no title, and he grew to Master of Coin, which is quite a growth. As the series goes on and he manipulates everybody around him, so then we learn that he conspired with the Arryns to kill off Jon Arryn, who is the original Hand of the King, in order to bring Ned Stark to King's Landing and incite this War of Five Kings, because he wanted to create an upset in a way to gain power. And that's where this greed capital sin ties in. That is ultimately what Petyr Baelish wanted this whole time, was power. And he admits to Sansa that his true goal is to become the king of the 7 kingdoms. He wants to rule it all. And what is more telling of greed? Greed, by definition, is the immediate want of wealth, power, fame. Even if it doesn't belong to any specific person, it's the obsession. And I think Petyr Baelish fits that role perfectly. And like I said, envy and greed, I think, really can blend together and have a lot of gray area. But I'm happy with my 2 choices. So let's jump into envy. Envy is resentment towards another person based on what they have and what you don't have. So a harsher form of jealousy, where somebody wants something that another person has so badly that it turns into direct hate for that person. That is what envy is, and it can be a very unhealthy emotion. And that's why I picked this character. And the character that I picked for envy would be Theon Greyjoy. Now, I think Theon Greyjoy is a very dynamic character. He definitely goes through a lot of changes and cycles throughout the series. He was ward to House Stark. He grew up with the Stark family, but he was born of the Greyjoy house. But when the War of the Five Kings started, Robb Stark sends Theon Greyjoy back to the Iron Islands to gain favor with his father and to gather men to help fight with Robb to overtake King's Landing and become ruler of the 7 kingdoms. So Theon Greyjoy does just that. He goes back to the Iron Islands and he doesn't get the response he was hoping for. His father does not take him seriously. He doesn't truly see him as his own son anymore. And he's willing to take Theon back and to allow him back into the family, but he would not be treated as the heir to the Iron Islands. His sister, Alara, is that her name? Okay, editing Emma here. I'm going to insert a comment. I'm sorry I forgot her name. Her name is Yara, Yara. Great character. I'm currently on editing hour number 10. I am not setting up this green screen to make more footage. I'm just gonna insert this in here. He gives all of Theon's ships to Asha. Gives Theon a very, very small portion of the forces to go and raid some small village that has no value. He basically brushes off Theon, and Theon gets very upset, and he's very jealous of this. So what does Theon do? Theon then instead takes his men and raids Winterfell, the home of House Stark, so that he can gain the favor back from his father. Theon turns against the only family that he ever knew to impress somebody who clearly did not want any part of him. And I think that really, really shows how damaging envy could be. Theon forgot everything that he had, all the good things that he had, because he wanted something else so badly that he forgot how the Starks treated him, how they supported him, how he grew up with them, and then instead betrays them for his father that he never knew, clearly did not love him. And I thought that was a very, very interesting thing. Theon then loses Winterfell to the Boltons, and he then goes on this whole story arc later on, but that's not why we're here today. We're going to jump to pride. Pride is the obsession with oneself and one's excellence. Now, I know I'm going to get so much hate for this, but I'm going to be assigning pride to Daenerys Targaryen. Now, I think Daenerys was a very, very strong character. I think she was amazing. I think Emilia Clarke did a fantastic job portraying her. But there were some moments where I would kind of look at Daenerys and say, was that really necessary? Daenerys was clearly a proud character. She was very proud of her house. Sometimes I think got a little bit carried away. Like when she started freeing the slaves and when she commanded the Unsullied army for a good period of time, seasons 4, 5, and 6, whenever anybody would be introduced to her, they would list all of her titles. No joke, it would take 30 seconds to name all of her titles. I'll play it.
You stand in the presence of Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, rightful heir to the Iron Throne, rightful queen of the Andals and the First Men, protector of the Seven Kingdoms, the mother of dragons, the Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, the Unburnt, the breaker of chains.
Is that really necessary? Girl, you have 3 dragons. That is all that you need to say. And it also becomes very clear Daenerys truly thinks that she's the only queen. And spoilers, when it is found out that Jon Snow is actually a Targaryen and he is the true king of the Seven Kingdoms, Samwell says to him, "It is quite clear that you would give up your crown for the better of the people, but would Daenerys give up hers?" And it was a point where the audience kind of understood. Would she really? I don't think that she would. She would constantly not take Tyrion's advice when he gave it to her. She instead did her own thing, what she thought would be best. And a lot of times, it didn't really work out. I think that she is very prideful, and I think a lot of times it can be a little bit of a disadvantage to her. Okay, next is Wrath. Wrath is the overacting of anger to create a very ugly response, to have it overtake your entire being, is a very powerful emotion. I think it is a very damaging sin. And wrath, I know I'm also going to get a lot of hate for this. Wrath is going to go to Cersei Lannister. Cersei, you either love her or you hate her. She's a very powerful character, a very dynamic, very elusive character, and her central identity ultimately was her children. She was very protective of her children, and I think part of it had to do with the fact that the whole world thought that her children were Robert Baratheon's children, but not really. They're really Jaime Lannister's children. Yes, her direct brother. Cersei, we see as the seasons go on, she has anger problems, I would say. I think is very, very destructive. She is not afraid to hurt innocent people to boost her own power. And what is the biggest example of this? When she killed the High Sparrow using dragonfire and killed many innocent people. in order to knock the High Sparrow out of power and to get rid of Marjorie, who was the wife of one of her sons, the king. She knew that Marjorie was manipulating Tommen, so she kills her. And unfortunately, Tommen literally jumps out of a window when he learns that Marjorie died. So in the end, Cersei's actions not only killed thousands of innocent lives in order to knock out only a handful of important people that threatened her power, but she also lost one of her children in the process. And I thought that was what Wrath was the emotion, the raw emotion that leads to damage and leads to hurting your own self. And finally, we are at number 7, Sloth. This had to have been the hardest one for me to pick. Sloth is in the name. It means you don't move. You go out of your way to avoid physical labor, mental labor, any sort of stimulant or task that could be trying or tiring. That is what Sloth is. And as I was going through and I was looking through all these characters, I didn't want to do a random person. I wanted it to be somebody that people recognize. And a lot of the main characters, they really don't fit that category. I thought Sloth was very hard, which is why I saved it for last. And it pains me to do this. It really, really pains me. But the Sloth title is going to go to Hot Pie. Now, Hot Pie is a young boy. When the show starts, he is introduced in season 2 or 3, I can't be sure. And he journeys with Arya when she runs from King's Landing, trying to make it back to Robb. And later on, when she's trying to make it to the north, Gendry and Hot Pie journeyed along with her. And they got to some town, and Hot Pie basically says, you know what, actually, I'm just going to stay here and bake bread. He could have had some amazing adventures with Arya and Gendry, and he chooses to stay and bake bread for the rest of his life, which is quite sad because Hot Pie was a very enjoyable character, I think, to be around. He was a great source of comedic relief in a very serious time, especially because Arya's storyline during that part of the series, I think, was very depressing. She was ripped away from her family at a very young age. She witnessed her father dying, and Hot Pie, I think, was sort of a light in the tunnel in a sense. He was very friendly and very nice to be around, and I always enjoyed watching Hot Pie. So when he left to become a baker, I got very upset about that. It was kind of heartwarming, but I was more upset at that fact. So that's why Hot Pie gets the Sloth title. I'm sorry, Hot Pie, but it had to happen. I had to give it to somebody, so I gave it to you. And that pretty much wraps it up. There are the 7 deadly sins compared with Game of Thrones characters. So let's list it off again. Gluttony, Robert Baratheon. Lust goes to Craster. Greed goes to Peter Baelish. Pride goes to Daenerys Targaryen. Wrath goes to Cersei Lannister. And Sloth goes to Hot Pie. I hope y'all kind of see the thought process that I had. I'd love to maybe start a conversation as what you guys think best represents the 7 deadly sins. And I'd love to just get that conversation going. So thank you all for staying this long if you're still there. And have a great day. Thanks.